Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about a case where people had a decision to make whether or not to oppose or support an energy development decision. And on the surface, this was a question about water, but at a deeper level, it becomes a decision about energy and oil shale. And so the questions that I was looking at were things about what are people willing to give up, and how does that change over time in relationship to energy development. So this project began with a study in the bioregional planning program here at USU, where we were evaluating the Upper Colorado River watershed under a contract with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I worked on the second phase of this project, where we focused on the Yampa White, the Colorado headwaters, and the Gunnison watersheds. And the goal here was to identify biodiversity hotspots using alternative futures planning. And that was sort of similar to the work that Janice Thompson presented yesterday. And one of our premises was that energy development will be one of the primary drivers of change in this region. So as we've kind of heard over and over again today, conflict management and public participation are critical issues for energy development. Several of the questions about public perceptions and conflicts arose from the alternative futures work, and these were things like, what can we learn about the local public's perceptions and processes and knowledge in energy planning and development issues? Where are there gaps? How is common knowledge around energy decisions created and changed? How are different symbols and meanings employed? And where are there some opportunities to improve knowledge, attitudes, and decisions about energy developments and impacts? And so this application for the Yampa River water rights was a perfect case to address some of these questions. So the tool I used for this study was discourse analysis. And discourse analysis is different from opinion research. If we wanted to know what people thought or what people actually knew, we could just do that with a survey or a questionnaire. But discourse analysis is a study of language and texts as social actions. It's one way of getting closer to what people are thinking and doing. And with it, we can ask questions about the hidden assumptions, the competing accounts, and the things that are taken for granted in the process of establishing common knowledge. There's no single theory or application for discourse analysis, and different approaches focus on different aspects of language, but the questions and methods are always tailored to the issue at hand. Most discourse analysis shares these four premises. The first is a critical approach to taken for granted knowledge. These are things like the belief that technology is going to make it possible for us to use oil shale. There's a historical and cultural specificity. So we live in a time where there is a demand for energy, even if it's expensive and difficult to obtain. There's a link between knowledge and social processes. What we know tends to come from our social interactions. We know oil shale is there. We know we have energy issues, but mostly because we've been told about those things, not because we have any direct experience with them. And then finally, there's a link between knowledge and social action. What we know leads to what we do. So because we know oil shale is there, we feel an imperative to use it. And we do things that give us a feeling of energy security because we're concerned about energy resources. Understanding these things can give us important contexts of things like culture, socialization, wealth, power, politics, and identity. So this case study I'm going to talk about started on December 30th, 2008, when Shale Frontier Oil and Gas filed an application for surface water and storage rights in Division 6 Water Court in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Shell wanted to take a total of 375 cubic feet per second out of the Yampa River and pump it to a reservoir they planned to construct. This was going to be a large reservoir. It would cover 1,000 acres of ground and hold 45,000 acre feet of water. The water would then be pumped to another location near Shell's oil shale leases, where it would be used in industrial oil shale activities. In addition to the extraction of oil, it could be used for indirect activities like power generation and trade for other water. So this map shows the locations. This large area is the Yampa River watershed. This is Dinosaur National Monument, and these large olive-colored areas are oil shale deposits. The Yampa River runs here, and the extraction point right here is important because it's above the confluence with the Little Snake River. So this does not involve Wyoming because all of the water is coming out of Colorado, and it remains a very localized issue. The reservoir site is here, so they're going to pump water across here, and then they'll pump water down here. And in these tiny, tiny spots, let's see if I can point at one right there, those are the existing 160-acre research demonstration and development leases that Shale owned. The other two, these two belong to other companies. And the larger blue areas are the 5,000-acre leases that Shale anticipated being able to get after they demonstrated that they were able to do this. So before we start looking at the discourse analysis, I want to introduce some of the key players and issues. We have water rights, the Yampa River, the people factor, oil shale, and Shell oil itself. So I don't think I need to explain water rights a lot to this crowd, but water in the West is subject to the doctrine of prior appropriation. If you have water rights, you need to use them or lose them. People who have senior water rights have priority, and those who have junior rights may not get any or enough water during dry years. So water is not property, but it's considered a right. And that right is not technically property, but it's treated like that in that it can be bought, sold, traded, exchanged, etc. An absolute right is the right to take water out of the river and use it. A conditional right is issued when a project is anticipated and the need for water is there, but the holder has to be diligent in developing that water right, or it'll be considered abandoned and someone else can claim it. The advantage of a conditional right is it puts a time stamp on the water right, and that's very important in this case. The Yampa River is considered to be the last wild river in the West. It's the last undammed tributary of the Colorado. The river supports agriculture, ranching, recreation, and tourism. And the rivers in this area of the Colorado Basin hold 4 endangered fish. And the lower reaches of the Yampa River are considered critical habitat for these fish, and they exist there mostly because this is undammed. The Fish and Wildlife Service has an agreement that limits new development of this water to 54,000 acre feet before mitigation will be required. And the Yampa is considered the only significant source for new water rights in the upper Colorado River system. And another important thing about this river is that this was a defining moment for the environmental movement. David Brower, as director of the Sierra Club, fought for this river. He traded the dam in Dinosaur against the Glen Canyon Dam. And that's a decision he expressed regret for the rest of his life. So this is a pretty monumental river in terms of the environmental movement. The western slope is a growing region. They're expecting a 75% increase in population between 2008 and 2030. 39% of the people here live in rural areas, and farming and ranching are very important. Agriculture is more than a job here. It's an identity and an amenity. Removal of the water from the river will have impacts on local economies and other opportunities such as recreation and tourism, growth, and other potential forms of energy production. There's a history of boom and bust cycles related to energy extraction here, and particularly with oil shale. Oil shale goes back to the early 1900s when the military first became interested in it as a strategic reserve. Attempts to tap into oil shale have gone on since then, and the last big bust was in 1982, and they called it Black Sunday. And that's when a plant near Parachute, Colorado was shut down without warning, and it put about 2,600 people out of work and sent the local economies into a tailspin. And the Front Range is an important factor too. Even though they're not in the Colorado drainage, the state as a whole has interest in that water. And the Denver-Boulder metro area is approaching 3 million people, and they're looking to the west to provide some of their water. And then oil shale. Oil shale is a very rich resource in this area. The Green River Formation in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming is about a 16,000 square mile area and holds the greatest concentration of oil shale in the world. Just over 70% of that is on federally owned land. Some things that we know about oil shale is that it requires significant amounts of water and energy to produce. But since it's not in commercial production, we can't be really sure. But the most recent analysis shows that 1 barrel worth of energy is required to get between 1 and 2.5 barrels of energy back out. So it takes energy to get energy. And this is actually a very low return rate. It's expressed as energy return on energy invested. And we see here it's between 1 and 2.5 to 1. This other figure down here is energy return on water invested, and it's a similar figure. This tells us that it takes 3 barrels of water to get 1 barrel of oil shale produced. And that's a fairly conservative measure because it doesn't include the water that's required for additional processing or water required for the production of energy to get the oil shale out itself. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 paved the way for the latest attempt at oil shale development, and that was done in the Bush administration during the lame duck presidency, opened up those additional 5,000 acre plots for lease. So that was in November of 2008. Shell Oil is another player in this. Shell was notable for their strategic scenario-based planning. They took an idea that the military was using and applied it to business in a very successful way. At the time of the water application, they held 3 of these 160-acre RD&D leases, and they anticipated securing the other 15,000 acres that was shown in the first map. Shell at the time was the leader in situ oil shale extraction. And the way they did this is they constructed a freeze wall by drilling holes 2,000 feet deep around the perimeter and then pumping refrigerant through them. And it takes about 6 to 18 months for the ground to freeze. And then they drill producer holes inside that barrier, extract the water, drill more holes and put heaters down, and between 5 and 6 years later, they've heated the ground to between 550 and 750 degrees Fahrenheit. And the kerogen starts coming out of those producer holes that were drilled for the water originally. So it's a very energy intense process. You can see why that energy return is fairly low. So what I did in discourse analysis was to go through and look for news articles between December 1st, 2008 and March 15th, 2010. The articles were screened for related content, and in the end, 40 news, opinion, and editorial pieces were selected. I started out by anticipating possible topics of discussion, and then through multiple readings developed additional topics that were used to evaluate these news pieces. Final ratings were conducted using 69 different variables with additional comments collected. And variables were things like, are they expressing approval or disapproval? Are they describing energy or water inputs? And are they using examples or equivalents to demonstrate what they're talking about? The issues that don't come up in those discussions are also important. And for the discourse analysis, I relied on the articles themselves, but I also used other documents such as water court papers, Shell's plan of operation, and a few other things as background and reference. So I'm just going to go through the timeline really quickly here. In early January, news articles started reporting the filing and analyzing what the impacts might be. On January 7th, 2009, a bill was introduced in the Colorado House by Representative Lundberg to reduce the severance taxes on oil shale. This wasn't reported in local news until March. In late January, there was a joint meeting of Routt and Moffat County Boards of Commissioners. Reports indicate that there was a lot of tension and apprehension about what was going to happen here. At this point and through February, reports talk about filing of opposition. It's necessary to file a letter of opposition with the court to be able to be informed and be a participant in the process. Some of the reports and spokespersons were really careful at this stage to say they're not really objecting to this, but they're filing as opposers just to be able to be in the loop. And then the conflict with the Front Range interests and developments were apparent and reported on from the very beginning. So just to go over some of the frames and the rhetoric used here, Shell used a lot of keywords and phrases, things like diversity of water rights, best management practices, mutual benefits, sustainable resources, and cooperating with others. They pointed out that they were accumulating water rights so that they wouldn't impact other users. There's an emphasis here on the technology being at least 10 years away. News reports started trying to demonstrate how much water was involved. They used river flows, acre-foot equivalents, like an acre-foot of water will supply a family of 5 for a year. And then they used other comparisons with other reservoirs for size. And there is no consensus at this point on whether or not this is a lot of water or just a little bit of water, and it's easy to frame it either way, because 375 cubic feet per second is about 8% of the peak flows in May and June, but it's also greater than the total flow in the river during a lot of the other months of the year. So we have the first mention at this point about how much energy and water are required, but these ideas don't really take hold yet. Nobody starts to talk very much about those. And the first reporting of the amount of water that the energy companies control came from the Denver Post. And they state this as a percentage, but nobody really pays attention to that very much either. And there's a concern that the water right states a flow, but not a quantity. So they say how fast they can take it out, but they don't limit or cap the amount of water they can actually take. Okay. In February, concerns started to grow over impacts to agriculture, recreation, economics, environment, growth, and development. And we start to see people expressing the feelings of powerlessness. And it becomes apparent that under the Fish and Wildlife Service Agreement, to protect the endangered fish, Shell has probably beaten everybody else to the punch for that last available water. Shell maintains that it expects that by the time of production, water usage will be 1 barrel of oil to 1 barrel, or 1 barrel of water to 1 barrel of oil. And then on February 25th, 2009, Secretary Salazar halts those oil shale leases. And that's not reported in relationship to these, to the water application issue. And then the deadline for filing opposition was February 28th of 2009. In March, we start to see the media characterizing this as a water war. And in mid-March, a group named Western Resource Advocates publishes a report on oil shale water rights in Colorado. Western Resource Advocates was the only environmental conservation group that seemed to take an active role in discourse. Some of the statements they made in this report are that energy companies are cornering the market on water, that there's evidence that it really takes 3 barrels of water to produce each barrel of oil, and they ask Shell to demonstrate if that's really truly otherwise. They talk about the industry's needs for energy inputs, and they talk about the amount and seniority of water rights. They point out that energy companies have extensively acquired water rights, including some very old rights that can't be preempted. What this tells people is that they have an effective monopoly on water that they depend on, and that the water rights of the farmers and ranchers in this region are very vulnerable. And the media picks up at that point on the cornering the market on water and the seniority of water rights, and they start echoing that. Shell admits that their current water use is actually 3 barrels of water. And comparisons state that the oil shale industry will use as much water as Denver, which is very important because rural people perceive that urban areas are a water threat. And there's a fine line here that Shell is trying to walk. They're saying that there's so much energy to be had out there that they need to get at it, and it's very, very important. But on the other hand, they're also saying that they can't produce it fast enough that it's going to have any impact on water. So it's kind of both things going on. And then at this point, we have the first reference to the oil shale bust in 1982, the Black Sunday event. In May, things start to calm down. We don't hear a lot. Most of the opinion and editorial pieces express disapproval. In June, there's a meeting of a board, 2 boards that are just advisory. They aren't going to have a lot to say as far as the final decision. And then in June, NPR airs a story, and they are the only ones to mention the Sierra Club history, and the only ones that suggest leaving the water in the river. These are sort of traditional environmental issues, and so that's the only case that we have of this sort of thing coming up. On October 10th, 2009, BLM announces a new round of oil shale leases, and they've downgraded these leases to 640 acres from the original 5,000, and they're only going to lease for 10 years instead of 20. And then on February 23rd, 2010, Shell withdrew their application. So Shell says, the withdrawal of the Yampa River water rights application should not be construed as an indication that Shell is pulling out of oil shale development. Shell intends to continue its oil shale research and development activities with the ultimate goal of creating a commercial oil shale recovery operation that is economically viable, environmentally responsible, and socially sustainable. but we don't know what environmentally responsible and socially sustainable are. And from a discourse perspective, this is really interesting because these terms are usually stated as environmentally sustainable and socially responsible. So those are flipped, and that's an interesting aspect. So there appears to be a good general understanding of some of the systems at issue in this matter. Water law, the energy industry, dynamics of growth, and socioeconomic systems were discussed with frequency, and less understood seem to be the environmental systems, water and hydrology, and the process of energy production. Water law understanding was indicated by discussions of matters such as prior appropriation, interstate agreements, competing claims, seniority, and ownership of water rights. And knowledge of the energy industry was demonstrated through discussions of technology readiness, water needs, past development attempts. Growth and socioeconomic awareness was evident in discussions of development needs, population growth, economic and agricultural recreation concerns. So just kind of to sum up, issues of discourse are different at different levels, such as local, regional, or national. The identities, culture, and values of a place really do matter. Western resource advocates pitched their message at the local level, and it seemed to be fairly effective. They told people things like Colorado is approaching a zero-sum game, and oil shale development would bring significant changes in Western economies, communities, and ways of life. One of the most significant aspects of such change would be in the use of water. So local people respond well when their needs and concerns are at issue and the issues are addressed in relatable ways. This indicates that there's an important opportunity for information and education about how energy is produced and what the impacts are by using a more personalized perspective. And then just a few questions for the future. What role does social media play? How are cultural symbols and identities drawn into framing and discourse? Which are effective and why? And are there identifiable patterns in the types, content, or shifts in energy discourse? And just as a final note, Shale did not pursue any of those final leases. In August of 2012, they were awarded to Natural Soda Holdings and ExxonMobil.